The royal palace of Velaris Prime had become a place of whispered grief and fading hope, and everyone who walked through its crystal halls could feel the weight of sorrow pressing down upon them, like a heavy blanket that refused to lift Princess Alindra. The only daughter of Emperor Corvin III lay motionless in her crystalline healing chamber, and her silver-blue skin had grown paler with each passing cycle until she looked more like a ghost than a living being. The bioluminescent patterns that once danced across her flesh like living starlight had dimmed to barely visible traces, and the court physicians could offer no explanation for what had befallen her. She had fallen into this strange sleep 3 lunar cycles ago, shortly after returning from a diplomatic mission to the Outer Rim territories, where she had been inspecting mining facilities and negotiating trade agreements with various alien species. No poison had been detected in her body despite extensive testing, and no illness could be identified by even the most advanced medical scanners in the entire galaxy. The princess simply would not wake, no matter what anyone tried, and her father watched helplessly as his beloved daughter drifted further and further away from the world of the living. Emperor Corvin had sent word across the Galactic Alliance, calling upon every species known for their healing arts, their mystical knowledge, and their advanced technologies. The reward he offered was simple but profound. For whoever saved his daughter would receive a permanent seat on the Imperial Council and the eternal gratitude of the Valorian Empire, which controlled over 200 star systems. The Knights of the Crystalline Order arrived first, their gleaming ships descending through the atmosphere like falling stars, and the people of Velaris gathered to watch with hope in their hearts. These ancient warriors had served the Valorian throne for 10,000 years, their mastery of energy manipulation legendary throughout the known galaxy, and many believed they would surely succeed where others might fail. Grand Knight Celerith led the delegation, a towering figure whose armor seemed to absorb and redirect light itself, creating patterns of brilliance that shifted with his every movement. He brought with him 12 of his finest knights, each one capable of channeling enough energy to power a small city, and together they prepared a ritual of awakening that had not been performed in over 1,000 years for 3 days and 3 nights. The knights surrounded the princess and channeled concentrated solar energy into her body, attempting to reignite her fading life force with the power of distant suns. The chamber blazed with light, so bright that observers had to shield their eyes, and the air crackled with raw power that made everyone's skin tingle and their hair stand on end. But when the ritual ended and the light faded, Alindra did not stir, and Grand Knight Celerith bowed his head in defeat, unable to understand how such power could fail. Next came the Minari Thoughtweavers, beings of pure psychic energy who existed on the boundary between the physical and mental planes of existence. They floated through the palace like wisps of colored smoke, their forms shifting and changing as they prepared to enter the princess's unconscious mind. The Minari attempted to reach into her thoughts, to find whatever darkness held her consciousness captive, and draw her back to awareness through sheer force of will. They searched for hours, probing every corner of her sleeping mind. But what they reported troubled everyone deeply. Her mind was not trapped or damaged, they explained, and there was no enemy holding her captive in some mental prison. It was simply absent, as if some essential part of her had wandered off and gotten lost, leaving her body behind like an empty house with no one home. The Dracaran battle monks followed the Minari, massive reptilian warriors who believed that all ailments could be overcome through discipline and the proper application of ancient combat techniques. They performed their sacred healing dances around the princess for an entire week, their movements precise and powerful, but she remained unchanged. Then came the Sylvan life singers from the forest worlds of the Eastern Spiral Arm. delicate beings who could commune with the very essence of living things and coax dying plants back to health with nothing but their voices. They sang to Alindra in harmonies so beautiful that hardened soldiers wept openly. But their songs could not reach whatever part of her had gone away. The machine priests of the Cogwork Collective arrived next. Cyborg beings who had merged their flesh with technology centuries ago and believed that all problems could be solved through proper engineering. They ran millions of calculations and tried dozens of technological interventions. But their computers could find no solution to the princesses' condition. Each group brought their greatest skills and their most powerful techniques. And each group failed completely. The princess remained unchanged, suspended between life and death like a leaf frozen in ice. And Emperor Corvin's grief deepened into something close to despair. Word of these failures spread throughout the Alliance, carried by traders and diplomats and news broadcasts that reached even the most distant colonies. Soon fewer volunteers came forward. For what could anyone offer that the greatest healers and warriors of the galaxy had not already tried? The challenge was deemed impossible by most experts, and the princess was considered beyond saving by those who studied such things. The Valorian court began making quiet preparations for her eventual passing, ordering ceremonial robes and selecting appropriate music for her funeral. Even as her father refused to give up hope entirely, it was in this atmosphere of resignation and sorrow that the human vessel Steadfast arrived in orbit around Valorous Prime, its battered hull and modest size drawing little attention from the palace authorities. The humans were a young species, having only achieved faster-than-light travel within the last 2 centuries, and they were not known for any particular healing abilities or mystical knowledge. Most Valorians assumed the ship was simply passing through on some minor errand of trade or maintenance, and they paid it no special attention. But aboard that humble vessel, a single crew member was reading the reports about the dying princess and feeling a strange sensation that he could not quite explain. Something about the pattern of her illness felt familiar to him, like a puzzle he had seen before in a different form, and he could not shake the feeling that he might be able to help. His name was Sam Howell, and he was about to do something that would change everything. The Steadfast was not a warship designed for battle or a diplomatic cruiser meant to carry ambassadors between worlds, and anyone who looked at it could see that immediately from its worn exterior and practical design. It was a maintenance vessel, a battered workhorse that traveled between stations and outposts, performing repairs that more sophisticated ships considered beneath their dignity. Hull was scarred from decades of service, and the paint had faded in places where micrometeorites had worn it away over countless journeys through the void. Its crew of 12 humans had been passing through the sector on their way to fix a malfunctioning water recycling system on a distant agricultural station when they heard the distress call that had gone out to the entire quadrant. Most of the crew had shrugged when they learned about the princess and then moved on with their regular duties without giving it much thought. The knights and mystics and great healers of the galaxy had failed. After all, so what could a bunch of human mechanics possibly contribute to such a hopeless situation? They were good at fixing broken pipes and rewiring electrical systems and keeping ancient machinery running long past its expected lifespan. But healing alien royalty was far beyond their area of expertise. But one crew member could not stop thinking about the reports he had read, and the more he thought about them, the more convinced he became that something important was being overlooked. His name was Sam Howell, and he had worked on the Steadfast for 6 years as a general maintenance technician, handling whatever problems needed solving on any given day. He was 34 years old and unremarkable in most ways, with calloused hands from years of physical labor and a quiet manner that made him easy to overlook in a crowd. He had no special training in medicine or alien biology, no advanced degrees from prestigious universities, and no mystical abilities whatsoever. What he did have was a strange feeling that he could not shake. A nagging sense that kept pulling his attention back to the princess's symptoms every time he tried to focus on something else. Something about the pattern of her condition reminded him of a problem he had once solved on an old agricultural station orbiting Mars. Back when he was just starting out in his career, the symptoms did not match exactly, since that situation had involved malfunctioning life support systems rather than sleeping alien princesses. But there was a similarity in the pattern that he could not ignore both cases involved. Something that should have been obvious but somehow kept getting missed by everyone who examined it. Sam found Captain Deborah Vance in her small office near the bridge, reviewing supply manifests and scheduling upcoming maintenance jobs for the crew. She was a practical woman in her 50s with gray streaks in her dark hair and the kind of steady competence that came from 30 years of keeping ships running in the depths of space. When Sam explained what he wanted to do, she looked at him with raised eyebrows and a skeptical expression that he had expected. She asked him what made him think he could succeed where the greatest minds in the galaxy had failed. And he admitted that he did not know for certain that he could. All he knew was that something about this situation felt wrong to him, like a machine that was making a noise it should not make. And he wanted to take a closer look. Captain Vance considered his request for a long moment, tapping her fingers against her desk as she weighed the potential embarrassment of failure against the small chance of success. Humans had earned a reputation in the galaxy for unconventional thinking, for approaching problems from angles that other species never considered. And while that reputation was sometimes exaggerated, it was not entirely undeserved. Finally, she nodded and transmitted a formal request to the Valorian court. Fully expecting it to be rejected or simply ignored, the response came within an hour, much faster than anyone had anticipated. And its contents surprised the entire crew. The princess's condition had deteriorated further during the night, and her vital signs were growing weaker with each passing hour. All were welcome to try to save her, the message said, even humble mechanics from distant Earth. For the Emperor had nothing left to lose and would grasp at any chance, no matter how small. Sam gathered a small toolkit. Not his full repair kit with all its specialized equipment, but just the basic instruments he carried with him everywhere he went. A multi-tool, a small scanner, a notepad, a flashlight, and a few other items that fit easily into his worn shoulder bag. He took a shuttle down to the palace alone, having politely refused offers of company from his concerned crewmates who wanted to provide moral support whatever happened next. He sensed it would require quiet and focus, and he did not want any distractions. The Valorian Palace was overwhelming in its beauty, and Sam felt his breath catch in his throat as he approached its gleaming spires. The Bria's entire structure seemed to be made of living crystal that sang softly in the wind, creating harmonies that shifted and changed with the movement of the air. Gardens surrounded the main buildings, filled with plants that seemed to glow with their own inner light, their colors shifting through the spectrum as visitors passed by. Sam felt profoundly out of place as guards in ceremonial armor escorted him through corridors that had seen emperors and generals and the greatest minds of 100 worlds. He was acutely aware of the grease stains on his work jacket that he had not quite managed to remove before leaving the ship, and he caught several Valorian officials glancing at his worn clothes with barely concealed disdain. But he kept walking, following his escorts deeper into the palace, toward the chamber where a dying princess waited for a miracle that might never come. Emperor Corvin received him in the healing chamber where his daughter lay, and Sam could see immediately that this was a being consumed by grief. The Emperor was ancient by human standards, over 400 years old, according to the briefing materials Sam had read. But his sorrow had aged him beyond even those considerable years. His Eyes held no hope as they regarded the small human who stood before him. Only exhaustion and the dull resignation of someone who had stopped believing in happy endings. Sam bowed respectfully and waited for the Emperor to speak, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down upon his shoulders. The Emperor's voice was heavy with exhaustion when he finally spoke, and Sam could hear in those words the sound of a father who had watched hope die slowly over 3 long months. "You are the mechanic," Corvin said, making it sound more like a statement than a question. "Yes, Your Majesty," Sam replied, keeping his voice steady despite the nervousness churning in his stomach. "I am. You understand that the greatest healers and warriors of the galaxy have already failed," the Emperor continued, gesturing toward the crystalline chamber where his daughter floated in a field of soft blue light. "That my daughter has not responded to any treatment or intervention, I understand," Sam said. "Then what makes you believe you can succeed where they could not?" Sam considered the question carefully, knowing that he needed to be honest rather than offering false hope to a grieving father. He looked past the Emperor to the chamber where Princess Alindra lay suspended, her silver blue skin pale and still, her luminescent patterns barely visible beneath the surface, even diminished as she was. There was something beautiful about her that transcended species, and something peaceful about her expression that struck Sam as important. She did not look like someone fighting against death or trapped in some terrible nightmare. She looked like someone who had simply drifted away. "Do not believe I can succeed," Sam admitted, meeting the Emperor's tired eyes with honesty. "But I noticed something in the reports that bothered me. Something that reminded me of a problem I once worked on. And I would like to take a closer look, if you will permit it." The Emperor studied him for a long moment, and Sam could see the internal struggle playing out behind those ancient eyes. Part of Corvin wanted to dismiss this human and his foolish hopes, to protect himself from yet another disappointment in a long series of failures. But another part, the part that was still a father despite everything, could not bring himself to turn away any chance of saving his daughter, no matter how small. "Do what you will, human," the Emperor finally said, stepping aside and gesturing toward the healing chamber. "I have nothing left to lose." Sam approached the chamber slowly, taking in every detail with the careful attention of someone who had spent his entire career looking for things that other people missed. The technology was far beyond anything humans had developed, with systems and interfaces that operated on principles Sam could only guess at. But the underlying logic seemed comprehensible if he thought about it carefully enough. Energy fields maintained the princess's body in a state of perfect stasis, while various monitoring systems tracked her vital signs with incredible precision, displaying information on floating screens that updated constantly. He spent the first hour simply observing, walking around the chamber and making notes on a small pad he carried in his pocket, not touching anything but looking at everything. The physicians who hovered nearby watched him with a mixture of curiosity and barely concealed condescension, whispering to each other in their musical language. They had already examined every possible variable and run every conceivable test using equipment that made human technology look primitive by comparison. What could this strange visitor from a backwater planet possibly notice that they had? Miss Sam ignored them and continued his examination. But he was not looking at the princess's biology or her energy patterns or her brain activity the way the physicians expected. He was looking at something much more mundane, something so ordinary that no one had thought to examine it closely. "Tell me about the diplomatic mission," he said finally, turning to face the gathered medical staff. The one she returned from before falling ill. One of the physicians, a tall Valorian named Cylindros, whose robes marked him as senior among the medical team, answered with obvious impatience in his voice. "The princess visited the Harmon mining stations in the Outer Rim," he explained. "She was inspecting facilities and negotiating new trade agreements. standard diplomatic work that she had performed dozens of times before. And we have analyzed every substance she might have contacted, every food she consumed, every being she interacted with. And nothing explains her condition. Was there any equipment malfunction during her journey? Sam Esqued-Cilindros frowned at the strange question, clearly not understanding why a mechanic would ask about such things when discussing a medical matter nothing significant. He replied, "Just minor issues with her personal vessel that were repaired before her return. What kind of minor issues? I do not have those details." The physician admitted, sounding annoyed at being asked questions he could not answer. "You would need to speak with the maintenance crews who serviced her ship." Sam nodded slowly, feeling that familiar tingle of recognition that came whenever he was getting close to finding a hidden problem. "I would like to do that," he said, "and I would also like to see her personal quarters if possible. The place where she slept before falling ill." The physicians exchanged glances with each other, clearly uncomfortable with this request. The princess's private chambers were not open to outsiders, and certainly not to alien mechanics of no particular standing who had arrived uninvited from a species barely out of its infancy. But the emperor, who had been listening silently from his position near the healing chamber, raised one slender hand to quiet their objections, grant him access. Corvin commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Give him whatever he asks forth." Next several hours were spent in investigation that the Valorians found completely baffling. Sam spoke with the engineering crews who had serviced the princess's personal vessel, asking detailed questions about every component that had been replaced or repaired. He examined the logs from her journey in meticulous detail, looking not at the diplomatic reports, but at the technical readouts from the ship's systems. Walked through her private chambers with a small device that measured air quality and electromagnetic fields, scanning walls and floors and ceilings, while the physicians trailed after him with growing frustration. They had scanned these same spaces with equipment far more sophisticated than anything humans possessed, and there was nothing to find. But Sam was not looking for biological agents or energy anomalies or any of the things the Valorians had searched for. He was looking for something much simpler, something so obvious that the advanced minds of the galaxy had overlooked it entirely. He found it in the ventilation system of the princess's sleeping chamber, hidden in a junction where several air ducts came together there. He said quietly, pointing to a small component that hummed almost imperceptibly. "Do you see it?" Cilindros leaned in close, his expression skeptical and slightly annoyed at having his time wasted. "I see nothing unusual." He said, "The harmonics are wrong," Sam explained. "Listen carefully." The physicians fell silent, and in that silence Sam pointed to a faint vibration that pulsed through the metalwork in a rhythm that matched no natural pattern during the repairs on her vessel. Sam said, "A component was replaced in the environmental control system, a component manufactured by Harmon Industries on the mining station she visited, and it is functioning within normal parameters, but it produces a harmonic frequency that interferes with certain biological processes." He pulled out his multi-tool and carefully removed the covering from the ventilation junction, revealing a small crystalline resonator that hummed with barely visible energy. For most species, this frequency would be completely unnoticeable. Sam continued, "But Valorians are sensitive to certain vibration patterns because your entire biology is based on crystalline structures. And this device has been slowly disrupting the princess's natural rhythms, pushing her deeper and deeper into a kind of hibernation states." Cilindros stared at the small device, then at Sam, then back at the device, his expression shifting from skepticism to something approaching wonder. "That is impossible," he whispered. "We scanned everything, every wavelength, every frequency, every possible emission. You scanned for things that might be dangerous." Sam replied gently, "But this is not dangerous to most species. It is not harmful by any conventional definition. It is just a small annoyance, a background noise that everyone ignored because it fell within acceptable parameters. But acceptable for whom? The parameters were set by engineers who were not Valorian, reached into the junction and carefully disconnected the resonator, and the faint hum ceased immediately, leaving a silence that somehow felt more natural than before now, Sam said. Tucking the device into his bag for later analysis, we wait. The first sign came within hours of Sam removing the device. And it happened so quietly that the monitoring physicians almost missed it. The bioluminescent patterns on Princess Alindra's skin began to brighten, slowly at first like distant stars emerging from behind clouds. Then with increasing intensity, as her body remembered what it was supposed to do, the soft blue-silver light spread across her arms and face in delicate swirling patterns that pulsed gently with each beat of her hearts. For Valorians had two hearts that worked together in perfect harmony. The court physicians clustered around her healing chamber, their earlier skepticism completely forgotten as they monitored her vital signs with growing excitement. Numbers that had been declining for months suddenly stabilized and then began climbing steadily upward, each reading better than the last. Her body temperature rose from the dangerous cold of near death to something approaching normal, and her breathing deepened from shallow, barely there whispers to strong, steady rhythms. Emperor Corvin stood at the edge of the chamber, his ancient hands gripping the crystalline frame so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. Tears streamed down his face, but he did not bother to wipe them away, for he had no shame in showing the galaxy how much he loved his daughter. He had not dared to hope for 3 long months, had forced himself to prepare for the worst even as he prayed for a miracle. And now that miracle was happening right before his eyes. By the next morning, the princess had moved for the first time since falling ill. Just a slight shifting of her hand and a flutter of her eyelids. But it was more movement than she had shown in 3 lunar cycles. The news spread through the palace like wildfire, passed from servant to servant and guard to guard until everyone knew that something wonderful was happening in the healing chamber. Sam watched from a respectful distance, near the doorway, uncomfortable with the attention that had begun to focus on him. As word spread about what he had discovered, he had never liked being the center of attention, preferring to do his work quietly and let the results speak for themselves. And this situation was making him deeply uneasy. Courtiers and dignitaries began gathering outside the chamber, crowding the corridors as they tried to catch a glimpse of the human mechanic, who had succeeded where knights and mystics had failed. They whispered to each other in dozens of languages, pointing at Sam and discussing him as if he were some exotic creature that had wandered in from the wilderness. Grand Knight Celereth approached Sam with an expression that mixed genuine humility with obvious confusion, his massive armored form moving with surprising grace through the crowd. "I do not understand," the knight admitted, his deep voice carrying clearly despite the noise of the gathering crowd. "We channeled the power of stars into her body and performed rituals that have awakened the dead in ages past. How could such simple interference defeat us where we could not be defeated?" Sam considered his answer carefully, knowing that his words would likely be repeated and analyzed by scholars and historians for years to come. "You were looking for a great enemy to battle," he said finally, "a poison to neutralize or a curse to break or a darkness to overcome. And you brought all your power to bear against an adversary that did not exist." Celereth tilted his head, clearly not fully understanding what Sam was trying to say. "Sometimes the problem is not an enemy at all," Sam continued. "Sometimes it is just a small thing that does not fit, a piece that was put in the wrong place by accident. And you cannot fight your way out of that kind of problem, no matter how strong you are. You can only find the piece and move it." The knight was silent for a long moment, processing this unfamiliar way of thinking about the universe and its challenges. "Humanity is young among the stars," Celereth finally said. "Your species has barely begun its journey. through the cosmos, while mine has existed for longer than your world has had complex life. But perhaps youth brings fresh eyes. Perhaps we who have lived for millennia sometimes forget to look at the simple things, because we have grown too. Accustomed to seeking complexity, he bowed deeply to Sam, a gesture of profound respect that made Sam want to disappear into the floor from embarrassment. I will remember this lesson, human. The knight said, and I will teach it to those who come after me. That evening, as the twin suns of Velaris Prime sank below the horizon and painted the crystal spires of the palace in shades of gold and purple, Princess Alindra opened her eyes. Sam was not present for the actual moment of her awakening. Having retreated to his shuttle to escape the crowds and prepare for departure, he had done what he came to do. And now he wanted nothing more than to rejoin the Steadfast and continue on with his work fixing broken things across the galaxy. But a messenger found him before he could lift off. A young Valorian in ceremonial robes who delivered a summons from the Emperor himself with breathless urgency. Sam followed the messenger back to the palace, walking through corridors now filled with celebration instead of grief. Music played from hidden speakers, and servants rushed about preparing for festivities that would continue for days. The healing chamber had been transformed completely from the somber place of despair that Sam had first entered, where there had been quiet weeping and whispered fears. There was now joyful laughter and excited conversation. Ellen sat upright in her chamber, still weak but clearly aware and alert, speaking softly with her father as attendants bustled around her, bringing food and water and comfortable cushions. When Sam entered, all conversation ceased immediately, and every eye in the room turned to look at him. The princess herself turned to regard him, and her eyes, luminous silver blue like captured starlight, held an intelligence and warmth that made Sam feel truly seen in a way he had never experienced before. "You are the one who found me," she said, and her voice was like music, like crystal chimes singing in a gentle breeze. Beautiful and strange and somehow exactly right. Sam bowed awkwardly, not knowing the proper protocol for addressing alien royalty and not particularly caring. "I just noticed something that others had overlooked, Your Highness," he said, keeping his voice steady despite his nervousness. Anyone could have done the same if they had thought to look in the right place, but they did not. Alindra replied, and a smile touched her lips. Fragile but genuine and full of gratitude, knights with power beyond imagining tried to save me with force. She continued, mystics who could reshape reality itself tried to save me with their will. And you saved me by listening to a ventilation duct. She laughed softly, a sound like silver bells. And Sam found himself smiling despite his discomfort. There is a lesson in that, I think, the princess said, one that I will carry with me for the rest of my very long life. Emperor Corvin insisted on the full ceremony despite Sam's repeated protest that such elaborate recognition was completely unnecessary. Sam argued that he had only done what any good mechanic would do when faced with a malfunction, that there was nothing heroic about noticing a problem and fixing it. But the Emperor would not be swayed by any of his objections. A life had been saved, Torvin declared, and not just any life, but the most precious life in the entire Valorian Empire. And such a deed demanded proper acknowledgement regardless of how humble the hero might be. Ceremony was held 3 days later in the Grand Hall of Stars, a chamber so vast that Sam could barely see the far walls through the gentle mist that filled the space. The ceiling soared hundreds of feet overhead, covered in crystals that displayed the actual positions of stars in the night sky above, creating the impression of standing beneath the open cosmos. Itself, representatives from dozens of species had gathered to witness the honoring of the human who had accomplished what their greatest champions could not. There were Valorians in flowing robes of light, Dracaran warriors in battle armor, Minari thought weavers floating like colored clouds, and hundreds of others whose species Sam could not even identify. He spotted his crewmates from the steadfast in the crowd, having been brought down from orbit as guests of honor. And Captain Vance gave him a small encouraging wave that made him feel slightly less alone. Sam stood before the assembled multitudes in his cleanest work clothes, having politely but firmly declined the elaborate ceremonial robes that the palace tailors had offered to make for him. He looked profoundly uncomfortable, a small figure in worn fabric surrounded by beings of power and majesty dressed in their finest attire. But there was a steadiness in his bearing that commanded a strange kind of respect. He did not fidget or look away, and he stood with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly who he was and did not feel the need to pretend. Otherwise, Emperor Corvin spoke first, his voice amplified by hidden technology, so that everyone in the vast hall could hear him clearly. He spoke of courage and humility, of wisdom that came not from ancient learning or mystical training, but from practical experience and careful observation. He spoke of the alliance between species that made such moments possible, the cooperation that allowed a human mechanic to stand in a Valorian palace and change the fate of an empire. The audience listened in respectful silence, many of them still struggling to understand how such a simple solution had eluded them for so long. Then Princess Alendra stepped forward. Moving with grace despite her recent ordeal, she had recovered remarkably quickly in the days since her awakening, her crystalline biology reasserting itself with vigor now that the harmonic disruption had been removed. Bioluminescent patterns on her skin blazed with renewed brightness, and her silver blue eyes sparkled with intelligence and life. When she reached Sam, she took his calloused hands in her own slender fingers, and he felt a warmth spread through him at her touch. "You asked for nothing," she said softly, though her words somehow carried throughout the hall for everyone to hear. "You expected no reward or recognition or glory. You simply saw a problem and fixed it because that is what you do." She smiled at him with genuine affection and continued, speaking, "That is the human way, is it not?" She asked. Sam shifted uncomfortably under her gaze, wishing more than anything that he could teleport back to his ship and escape all this attention. "We try to help where we can, Your Highness," he managed to say. "That is all. Nothing more than that." Alendra shook her head gently and turned to address the assembled crowd. Still holding Sam's hands in her own, though, she said, her voice growing stronger, "That is not all. The galaxy is full of heroes who seek glory," she proclaimed, "warriors who fight for honor and recognition, scholars who pursue knowledge so that history will remember their names. These are noble pursuits, and I do not diminish them," she continued. "But there is another kind of heroism that is quieter and less celebrated. It is the heroism of those who simply do what needs to be done, without fanfare and without expectation of reward. The mechanics, and farmers and builders and cleaners who keep civilization running while others chase greatness. They fix what is broken and grow what is needed and construct what is required. And they ask for nothing in return except the satisfaction of a job well done today. We honor not just one human," Alendra declared, "but the spirit he represents, the spirit that looks at a problem and asks not how to conquer it or transcend it, but simply how to fix it. The galaxy has much to learn from such practical wisdom, and I hope we are wise enough to remember this lesson." The crowd erupted in applause that seemed to shake the very walls of the great hall, and Sam felt his face flush red with embarrassment. Emperor Corvin presented him with a ceremonial seal crafted from living crystal, explaining that it granted Sam the status of Friend of the Throne, a distinction that carried significant diplomatic weight throughout the alliance. Sam accepted it with mumbled thanks, tucking it carefully into his pocket, clearly eager for the ceremony to end so he could return to the comfortable anonymity of his work. But before he could make his escape, Princess Alendra approached him one final time as the crowds began to disperse. "Will you stay?" she asked quietly so that only he could hear. "There is a place for you here if you want it," Any position you might desire. Anything at all, Sam smiled. A genuine expression that softened his weathered features and made him look younger than his years. I appreciate the offer, Your Highness, he said, more than I can properly express. But I have work waiting for me out there among the stars. He gestured vaguely upward, toward the cosmos displayed on the ceiling high above. There are stations that need maintaining and systems that need repair, he explained. Nothing as important as this may be, but important to the people who depend on them. Melindra nodded slowly, understanding in her luminous eyes, even as a hint of disappointment flickered across her face. Then go with my blessing, Sam Howell, she said, and know that you will always be welcome in this palace whenever your travels bring you near. For as long as I live, I will remember what you did for me. Sam bowed one final time, a proper bow that he had practiced in his quarters the night before, and then walked out of the grand hall of stars. An hour later, the Steadfast broke orbit and jumped to faster than light speed, its worn hull carrying its crew toward the next job and the next problem and the next opportunity to helping the palace far below. Princess Alindra stood at her window, watching the stars where the human vessel had disappeared into the infinite darkness between worlds. She thought about the lesson she had learned during her long sleep, about the power of simple solutions and practical wisdom and the quiet heroism of ordinary people doing ordinary work. And she smiled, knowing that somewhere out there among those countless stars, a mechanic named Sam Howell was already looking for the next thing that needed fixing.